After just shy of 18 years, the Horus Heresy, the series that has defined many people's perceptions of Warhammer 40,000, will finally draw to a close. And the question on a lot of people's minds is, now what?
That's right, Crabs. Now hand over the secret Krabby Patty formula. What? I don't know. I never thought I'd get this far.
Well then, allow me to suggest your next move.
Hi, I'm Chrono the Harlequin, and I'm just addicted enough to this series that I probably will cry at the end of the Death Volume 3, regardless of how good the book is. Now, one thing I should say right off the bat is, I'm sorry this video is late, because it was actually supposed to be about comparing Warhammer 40,000 to Dune, and not just on a surface level, but in a more deeper way. However, my schedule has been a complete nightmare, I haven't had a bit of breathing room, I'm 5 days out from my last upload, and I didn't even get the chance to start recording anything, and I can just tell that Dune video is probably gonna run a little longer, so I'm making this one as a bit of a stopgap, praying to God my schedule clears up. So, in the meantime, let's talk about what GW can do to follow up the end of the Horus Heresy. What can be their next big book series to keep bringing people in, keep funding the hobby, and just generally entertain us fans? Okay, a little thing here. I meant to cover several topics that could be used as a book series following the Horus Heresy, but talking about the Great Scouring kind of got away from me, so this is basically just a scouring video now. I'm sorry, guys. But before we dive into it, let me just say thank you so much for watching this video, and please subscribe if you have not already done so, and without further ado, let's dive right in. Now, before I get into what options GW has, I would like to stress why it's important for them to do this. Because the Horus Heresy brought in so many fans to the hobby and got them to stay there. A lot of the newer stuff can be really hostile to people who don't know the lore, and the Horus Heresy was understandably a great gateway into the hobby and the fandom in general. However, it also introduced people to the Primarchs, which are a lot of people's favorite part of the lore. The fan art of them all should really tell you that much. That's the big benefit of these book series. Having characters be explored and continually built upon, and evolving and growing, because that's what people latch onto, not just the setting but the characters therein. Even characters who have small bit parts will become highly beloved and fixated on. Just look at Saul Tarvitz, who did not last long, but is still remembered very, very fondly. Further still, many Horus Heresy books, like Legion and Know No Fear, and obviously Horus Rising, ended up on the bestsellers list and are critically acclaimed, not just as 40k books, but as pieces of literature in general. These are of a very high caliber, and honestly wasting that potential just because the Horus Heresy ended. Now, I know that doesn't make these books a guaranteed success, just look at the War of the Beast, but I think it's a safe bet if Black Library has at least learned from some of their blunders. It also needs to be said that one thing that has kept Warhammer 40,000 going so long is the fact that new lore has been given at a steady yet slow pace. Things haven't just been forced on us or dumped down our throats, causing the fandom to burn out or the story to drag on too long, or for things to just come to a conclusion. Having the Horus Heresy let people engage with Warhammer and the setting without just burning out the storyline and having to reboot into, say, the Age of the Emperor that a lot of people theorize, you know, kind of like how fantasy became Sigmar. Okay, I think I've stalled long enough, so let me start cutting in. When I say series that will follow the Horus Heresy, the first thing that's going to come to mind is the Great Scouring. That being the chaotic period in the galaxy right after the Traitor Legions were defeated on Terra and started moving towards the Eye of Terror, as well as being otherwise driven out of the galaxy. Because this was not a very clean, simple affair. It wasn't just, oh no, we lost it, well, better all go to the Eye of Terror. Traitor Legionaries were still active across the entire galaxy and had to be pushed back piece by piece by piece. This actually happened on order of the Emperor himself before he was interred on the Golden Throne, stating that all memory of the traitor should be erased and they should be imprisoned in the Eye of Terror forever, where the galaxy can forget they ever existed. That's an older piece of lore, and I don't know if they'll stick with that in the End of the Death Volume 3, but we'll see what happens. Now, right off the bat, one of the reasons a lot of people want this series more than the other ones I'm gonna name is because it has a lot of key moments that people have heard about consistently or seen in parts, but have not seen in their totality. Examples being the Battle of the Iron Cage, where the Iron Warriors fought the Imperial Fists and absolutely wrecked them by baiting them into a trap. Now, some people say it was a draw, or that the Iron Warriors didn't win. They won. The Iron Warriors won. Let's just leave it there, okay? I see you in the comments. No, you're biased. And there's also the campaigns of the Dark Angels against various traitor elements, and obviously the Fallen. We get to see the fall of Caliban, which we have seen in bits and pieces, but we would now get to see in its totality. Something that would be really important, obviously, now the fact that the Fallen are being redeemed and the Lion is returned and Luther is currently at large somewhere in the galaxy. GW, please don't forget about that. It seems like you might have. As well as other events such as the Battle of Escrador, which I am very interested in considering my Alpha Legion fixation that many of you are aware of, and the Hunt for Fabius Bile, wherein Vulcan would personally declare that Fabius Bile must be brought to justice for all his crimes and abuses over the heresy and the siege, and eventually corner him, thereby driving him into the Eye of Terror, where a lot of his story would truly begin. This is also big because, again, Fabius Bile has returned to the setting. We could also get more stuff with Azek Ahriman, who again is returning to the setting with his new book. And quick note here, right while I was recording this video, I uploaded a short about The Hunt for Fabius Bile by Vulcan, and a user by the name of Deus1521 commented that he wants a series about the Scouring because he wants to know what happened to characters like Jago. I completely forgot about Jago Savatarian when I was working on this video to start with, and yeah, that's totally true. We completely lose track of Savitar. The last we heard of him was during the Heresy, where he was aboard the Invincible Reason, the Dark Angel's flagship, as a prisoner, and was suffering because his psychic powers had been partially awakened, which caused him great pain. However, that pain would be eased by a little girl who was a member of the ship's astropathic choir named Altayani, and he would actually break out and kill the master of the astropaths when he found out he beat her until her spine broke because she spoke to him. That is the last we ever see of a wildly beloved character of the Night Lords. He just vanishes after that. And I think finding out what happened to him, whether he's still aboard the Reason, whether or not they killed him, whether he managed to escape somehow, would be really interesting to a lot of people. And furthermore, after that hunt for Fabius Bile, that's when Vulcan would effectively go into exile, departing from his legion until the War of the Beast 1,500 years later. He would do this under the pretext of leaving so that he can appear when he is most needed at the quote final battle, kind of like Leman Russ with the quote unquote wolf time. That's really the crux of what makes a Scouring book series so appealing. We get to see the send-off of a lot of these characters. Yes, we have seen Guilliman getting his throat slit already in one of the Dark Imperium books, but we get to see everything leading up to that now. And we get to see what was going on with the Night Lords before Conrad Kurz died, and we could get to see the disappearance of Rogel Dorn, which is something a lot of people have speculated on. We're not ready to say goodbye to all these characters, both the Primarchs and a lot of the Space Marines we've grown to love and have really attached ourselves to over all these years. As such, a Scouring book series would really help us see that through. Would it be anywhere near as long as the monster that was the Horus Heresy in Siege of Terra? Absolutely not. I don't think anything in 40k ever will be. That was a very singular thing, but that doesn't mean it has to be particularly short. I would like to note that's a bit of a running thing for all the things I'm gonna list in this video. All of these would be series of like, what, 10 books at most, and not like the 50, 60 books we got with the Heresy and the Siege. And another thing to mention is also that with the Primarchs returning to the setting, you know, we have Guilliman and the Lion back, some of the traitors are already back or have at least been mentioned in part. We're probably gonna get Rogel Dorn coming back and Jagatai Khan coming back, whose disappearance does also take place in the Scouring. This would give context to those things. We would finally get to see the disappearance of Korax and the Khan and Dorn, all of which are things that should be reasonably covered before you start bringing them back. And another thing to mention is that it would also get to show us the creation of the chapter system. You know, the breaking of the first founding legions into what we know today in the 41st millennium. Because a lot of the characters that get touched on and mentioned during the Siege of Terra and the Horus Heresy are ones that we know of to become chapter masters after the Horus Heresy was over. To name a few, we get to see Fafnir Rand, who becomes the head of the Executioners. We also get to see Nasir Ahmet, who becomes head of the Flesh Terrors. You know, Maximus Thane becomes head of the Fists Exemplar. Zephon the Blood Angel becomes head of the Charnel Guard. Over and over again, and we would finally get to see the formation of these chapters that are so important to the setting later on. We also get to see conclusions to stories of people like Euphrates Keeler, who is an immensely important character because she was the first saint of the Imperial cult. That's another thing we would see in the Scouring. The birth of the Imperial cult as a proper institution. Its rise from a fringe belief to a driving force during the siege, to finally the head of the Imperium effectively up until certain events. Because in this period, we see the memory of the Horus Heresy fade out, and the myth of the Emperor having always been a god and ascended to the Golden Throne really take root in a way that could never ever be dislodged later on. And we would also get to see the birth of the Inquisition, something that I find immensely interesting because I'm me and I fixate on the Inquisition a lot. I just love those kind of characters. Alpha Legion, Inquisition, Malcador, I think you guys have my measure at this point. Because it is after the Horus Heresy we see those people known as the Chosen of Malcador fully evolve into what we now know as the Inquisition. This would include characters we have followed throughout the heresy, such as Kirill Cinderman, who would actually survive all the way up until the end of the War of the Beast under the name of Varius. Varius being an Inquisitor, so we could see the role he played in that. And we would also get to follow up with people like Zaranchek Xanthus, who has been playing an increasing role across the end of the Siege of Terra, specifically the End in the Death books. And in all my videos about the End in the Death books I've been making, one thing I always come back to is the fact that Zaranchek Xanthus is the first Xanthite, that being the subsect of radical inquisitors who believe that humanity should seize the powers of chaos, learn to control them, and utilize them to better combat it. This is a view that is considered blatant heresy by many other people in the Imperium, and Xanthites often face execution when they're caught and brought to trial. Xanthus himself would be burnt at the stake in M32. It's not clear if this happened before, during, or after the War of the Beast, but I think it probably happened before, and we would get to see his road down that path, which would ultimately lead to his death. And there's also another Chosen of Malcador named Moriana. Now, Moriana Muhausen is one of those characters who is not as well known in the community, but casts a pall across the setting, because she was one of the Chosen of Malcador. However, she would actually fall to chaos. This is because she was part of the faction known as Horusians, people who believed that the power that had come to possess Horus could be used to reanimate the Emperor in one way or another. This is actually touched on in a book series called The Horusian Wars by John French. And she would eventually fall to chaos because of these beliefs, moving to the Eye of Terror of all places, and becoming a close advisor to Abaddon the Despoiler himself, and be present at the very inception of the Black Legion, guarding them as sort of a prophet or a wise woman. And she was actually the one who would start telling Marines in the Eye of Terror what the Imperium had become, that it was now a theocratic state which worshipped the Emperor as a god, something some of these Marines would actually find absolutely hysterical because, quote, the word bearers won. She appears in the book Black Legion, The End in the Death Volume 1, where we see her performing duties as one of Malcador's Chosen, and the book Iron Warrior, the novella starring the character Hansu that a lot of people like, because she is still alive in the 41st millennium. Hansu was active during the 13th Black Crusade and some of the old lore, and she was there to advise him. And there was actually a funny moment where she was introduced to him as saying, oh yeah, she was an advisor to Abaddon, and Hansu would scoff and is like, oh yeah, that means so much. Again, she too, like Xanthus, is highly fascinating to me, and I would like to see their descent and where they go from here, especially since they're being set up at the very, very end of the Siege of Terra. And on a similar vein of reasoning, we would also get to see the birth of the Grey Knights as they would become in the millennia thereafter, because we leave them off at the end of the Buried Dagger, the last book of the Horus Heresy proper, wherein they travel to Titan via Webway Gate, leaving Garvia Loken behind, in order to become the Grey Knights, before they had been Knights Errant, Chosen of Malcador, ones who were very psi-active, but Malcador would prepare them in both mind and body to become Knights of the long war to come against chaos that he had foreseen, in order to hold back the tide. I think part of the reason this is important is because the Grey Knights have been very much ragged on and kicked around by the fandom lately because their lore has been pretty heavily bungled. A lot of people find them to be uninteresting, almost like Mary Sue's, almost bordering into full grim derp because it's just really overpowered and poorly defined what they can and can't do. And I believe showing their birth and inception as a proper legion in a Scouring book series would go a long way in regards to redeeming them in the eyes of the fandom, because the concept is really cool, but it's honestly pretty wasted at this point. Now, as I said in the start of this video, this was supposed to be a much more general video, but ended up getting really specific to the Scouring, so I'm gonna circle back and go to some stuff that I kind of glossed over earlier. One being the Alpha Legion. We don't know thus far what happens to the Alpha Legion after the Siege of Terra, aside from the Battle of Escrador, because what we do know is that after the battle, they shattered because the Primarch either died or faked his own death. He did not die. I just want to get that out of the way. Whichever Primarch was still alive faked their death on Escrador, I'm 100% sure of that, and would separate as a cohesive fighting force, turning into smaller units pursuing various goals. Now, while the Alpha Legion was actually loyal at the end of the day when it comes to the heresy, they do almost entirely become traitors after the fact. So we might get to see the beginnings of that process in the Alpha Legion, and hopefully find out about some of the characters that are named in the Alpha Legion, such as Bokron, Autolon Score, Ingo Petch if he's still alive by the end of the Death Volume 3, and others. And two other things we might get to see are the solidification of the Dark Mechanicum, that being those traitor Mechanicus forces who fled into the Eye of Terror led by Kelbor Hal, who would become the Dark Mechanicum, the heretics we know today, and don't see much of. It would be a cool way to start introducing them into the setting and giving them the love I feel they deserve, as well as showing how they solidified as a proper institution within the Eye of Terror, because there's a lot of really interesting potential there. And again, we don't know what happens to Kelbor Hal as of yet. Furthermore, we might also be able to see the Legion Wars, or the Eye of Terror Slave Wars, which was the period of time in which all the traitors who were going to the Eye of Terror made it there, and then started squabbling amongst themselves for planets, resources, and especially slaves, because, again, how are they going to get along? And they were also sorting things out through hurt feelings after the Siege of Terra loss, which was very traumatic for them. The Sons of Horus specifically were heavily targeted and had their numbers greatly reduced, because people blamed them for the whole thing. You know, hey, this whole operation was your idea. And they would eventually go on to rebrand as the Black Legion, something we see in Aaron Dembski-Bowden's Black Legion books. Now, I should note, in Bowden's Black Legion books, we see the aftermath of the Legion Wars, when all the legions are reeling, everyone's hurt, everyone's listless, and it's the perfect environment for the Black Legion to form, but we don't see the wars themselves, and I think we could catch some glimpses of that, because there are some very interesting things that happen during them. The most notable of these being the Battle of Scalathrax, which saw the World Eaters face off against the Emperor's Children, who again a lot of people were fighting against because people really hated them back in the Eye of Terror, and would see Karn turn on his fellow World Eaters because they were on a planet that had deathly cold nights and everyone sought to seek shelter instead of freezing to death. This pissed him off a lot, so he took a flamer and started scorching friend and foe alike. This earned him that moniker of Karn the Betrayer, something that has stuck for 10,000 years, and would see the World Eaters broken as a unified fighting force thereafter. Again, Karn is a beloved character, and a lot of people would absolutely love to see that. I feel like all these things would be a nice sea change from the Horus Heresy and Siege of Terra, because throughout those books, it was the Imperium on the back foot, and we followed as they had to fall back and make exceptions and continually suffer as the traitors pushed on more and more. The traitors were the ones on the offensive and were meeting with success. We could see a huge tonal shift with a Scouring book where it's now the traitors lamenting their defeat, possibly regretting everything, descending into what they would later become as they are pushed back by a vengeful Imperium. We could see the rise of the Black Templars finally, which would be awesome. We could see Sigismund and what he becomes, because as we know, Sigismund goes on to lead the Black Templars as their first High Marshal and would die to Abaddon at the very start of the First Black Crusade. Oh yeah, that's another big thing that could come from a Scouring book series. The First Black Crusade. This was what cemented the creation of the Black Legion and saw the Traitor Marines return to the setting. We see bits and pieces of it in, again, Aaron Dembski-Bowden's Black Legion books. We see the start of it and a bit of the aftermath, but we don't get to see it in its entirety, and I think that would be really interesting. Because again, a lot of stuff happened, Abaddon was injured fighting Sigismund, he claimed his demon sword Draknaen, all these things, and it takes place about like 7,500 years after the heresy. Honestly, the more you think about it, the more potential there is for book material and cool things to happen in a Scouring book series. This would basically take place all the way from the very, very end of the siege to the gates of the War of the Beast. or even a little bit before that, maybe just capping out the millennia of M31. And it could also be an interesting segue into some Eldar lore, seeing how they react to the new state of the galaxy, because they are starting to play a bit of a role in the End in the Death Volume 2, you know, they were narrating the events there. We just might see some stuff as they reorganize, they accept things for what they are, because this period also does see the rise of Asdrubal Vecht as a Lord of Camorra. You know, the guy who now controls the entire Dark City. We might get some Dark Eldar stuff, some regular Eldar stuff, we might get some Harlequin stuff, who knows? Anything's up for grabs, really, because this period of the lore is very ill-defined. You know, it's just all White Dwarf articles and scant references from other books, so GW would have a pretty free hand in regard to what they could do. However, that's maybe not always a good thing, considering how the War of the Beast went. But what do you guys think? Do you guys want to see a Scouring book series, or do you think maybe it wouldn't be that good and we should focus on more modern stuff in the setting? Is there any other periods in the lore you'd like to see books for, such as the Age of Apostasy or even the Fall of the Eldar? I do need to make an actual video where I cover possible book series other than the Scouring. I will make sure to get to that, but I do also need to make that Dune video. Oh boy, things have been a mess lately, guys. However, I would love to hear what you guys have to say in the comments below about the Scouring and a potential book series, and until then, I will see you in the next video.